Hey, we're gonna go ahead and get started now. Um, Hello and welcome to our Female War Correspondents in World War II webinar. We are the IHL YAC team for the Capital Area chapter based in North Florida, where it is snowed for the second year in a row as of today. And we've been working under different names, but some of the same people for about 7 years now. As a part of our campaign, we run a rather prolific Instagram account. We occasionally put on webinars such as this one. Once again, please fill out the attendance form in the chat before we begin. Um, if you're still working on the form, just put a 1 in the chat, like a number 1, once you're done so we can know we can move on. The attendance form is really important for our campaign data tracking. If you can't submit the form right now, you can also just send us a private message in the chat with your name and email. This is also what we will be using for volunteer connection hours for our NCFL Red Crossers. So that includes North and Central Florida and the US Virgin Islands. NCFL Red Crossers do not need to do anything additionally. They will automatically receive hours for this event by completing the attendance form. For those of you not within the region, unfortunately, you will need to manually log your hours for the event post-webinar. And if you are part of an NCFL club attending as part of the competition, make sure to include your school or club name in the second question. We also love our QR codes and links, so we'll be pasting a lot of those in the chat throughout our webinar. But we know a lot of you may be watching from your phone or another device where that might not be convenient. So we encourage you to use the chat, and we'll also include the links in our post-event email for your use. So while people are getting the form taken care of, as usual, I'd like to start off with a few quick disclaimers for our event. We may take screenshots during the event for our data tracking and to post event press releases on our social media accounts, but we will not depict any names or faces. If anyone has their camera on any images for your privacy. Because we're on Zoom, we'd also like to ask everyone to make sure their microphones are on mute at this time. We will have a period for questions halfway through the presentation and at the end of it, where you are welcome to come off mute and verbally ask any questions if you'd like. Please feel free to use the chat for any comments, but if you have any event-related questions, please use the Q&A feature so we can ensure that they don't get lost in the regular chat. Our presentation does include references to armed conflict in World War II, but does not contain any descriptive, political, or otherwise triggering or inflammatory information or messages to align with American Red Cross and our personal guidelines. If you feel uncomfortable at any time, please don't hesitate to step out or turn us on mute as needed. We'll first start off with a general explanation of military journalism, the fundamental principles of IHL, and IHL protections for journalism. Then we'll learn about 3 key female war correspondents and their contributions. So we'd first like to start off with a quick poll of what does military journalism mean to you, just as a quick little brain teaser. So if you could join the Mentimeter code, it's up at the top, and we're also putting the link to Mentimeter in the chat. I hope everyone can see my screen. But we welcome you to add anything to do with any of the themes of our presentation today. So that includes World War II, journalism in general, IHL, and female war correspondents. So we're going to create like a mind map with everybody. A lot of people have picked bravery. I think that's really good, especially during World War II. This was one of the most dangerous jobs you could have on the field in addition to being a soldier. Research during war, battlefield, they were definitely creating awareness. I like how some people said IHO. Conflict, documenting and recording. It's definitely important for civilians. Informative, reporting. These are all really great words. If you are unable to open or interact with the Mentimeter right now, you can also drop your words in the chat and we'll plug them in for you. We'll spend a few minutes here before we move on to the bulk of our content. Courage is really good as well. Yeah, documentation. A lot of the reason we know what was going on, or we've seen pictures of like the liberations of the concentration camps during World War II, documentation was really important, especially through military journalism. We'll give it around 1 more minute for people to get their words in. Right. Yeah, this is a really great list of words. Thank you all so much for participating. Let's go ahead and move on to the rest of our content. And just making sure everyone can see the screen again. So we'd like to set the stage for the rest of today's webinar with this quote from Ernie Pyle, who's one of the most renowned World War II journalists, famed for highlighting the experiences of hidden heroes and individual stories across the fiery landscape of war across both the Western and Pacific theaters of World War II through his writing. But there are so many of the living who have had burned into their brains forever the unnatural sight of cold, dead men scattered over the hillsides and in the ditches along the high rows of hedge throughout the world. Dead men by mass production, in one country after another, month after month, and year after year. Dead men in winter and dead men in summer. Dead men in such familiar promiscuity that they become monotonous. Dead men in such monstrous infinity that you come almost to hate them. Those are the things that you at home need not even try to understand. To you at home, they are columns of figures, or he is a near one who went away and just didn't come back. You didn't see him lying so grotesque and pasty beside the gravel road in France. In this quote, Pyle speaks of the hefty toll on life caused by the war, so much so that to see the dead was a normal daily occurrence. He speaks to those at home, reading the news of the war on the other side of the world, telling them that they have not bore witness to the death and destruction that is occurring. While reading through the lens of war correspondents on the field gains some perspective about current events, it cannot beat seeing or living it yourself. But military journalism itself has been around for a while. These are some highlights in history. Today, we'll be focusing on military journalism during World War II and the lessons it has had for the present. News coverage has changed from World War II to now, but we can still see some similarities in reporting, the stories people focus on, and the ways they hope to convey messages. We'll pause for a few seconds here for everyone to do a quick skim. There are three types of journalists on the field during armed conflict: freelance journalists, war correspondents, and the military press. Freelance journalists are people who work independently of news organizations and the military. They are civilians and are not entitled to POW status and cannot be detained except on imperative reasons of security. War correspondents are those who accompany the armed forces but are not members of the armed forces themselves. They are civilians entitled to POW status according to Geneva Convention 3, Article 4A4. And finally, the military press includes members of the armed forces that report about the military. They're not civilians and are entitled to POW status. Journalists in such dangerous situations must be aware of two competing interests in reporting about armed conflicts. One, the public's right to be informed, and two, national security concerns, which may require confidentiality. If a media station is contributing to violence, then it can be classified as a military objective and is thus liable to attack under IHL. IHL is primarily governed by the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. It governs the legal and ethical conduct of armed conflict, leading to less suffering for the victims involved. The four principles of IHL are limiting unnecessary suffering, or making sure tactical measures do not cause more harm than their potential benefit, proportionality, that the anticipated cost of an attack to civilians or civilian objects does not outweigh the military advantage of that attack, distinction, that all parties must distinguish themselves between civilians and combatants, and military necessity, which is that combatants can only engage in military acts that are necessary to defeat an enemy. Here are some ways that IHL protects journalists and journalism. Geneva Convention 3 is the first major piece of international law applying to military journalists, and it was first adopted in 1929 before being significantly revised 20 years later at the conference in 1949. Article 4A4 governs who is entitled to POW status during armed conflict and is applicable to people who accompany armed forces without actually being members of those forces. Article 4A4 explicitly includes war correspondents who have received permission from the armed forces that they accompany, meaning war correspondents are treated as civilians. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, of 1966 provides an international legal framework for civil and political rights like the freedom of expression and the right to provide and seek information. Article 19 of the ICCPR discusses freedom of expression and the right to hold opinions without interference, as well as how that right is subject to restrictions protecting national security. This legislation falls under international human rights instead of international humanitarian law, or IHL. Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions was introduced as an amendment concerning the protection of civilian victims of international war. Article 79 of Additional Protocol 1 details protection specifically for journalists and states that, for all intents and purposes, journalists engaged in dangerous missions in armed conflict areas are considered and protected as civilians. Article 79 also notes that journalists can obtain an identification card to mark them as a journalist when they engage in war reporting, falling under the principle of distinction. Article 51.3 provides insight into this as well, stating that civilians must be protected unless they take direct part in hostilities, which is when they lose their civilian status and become combatants. UN's Security Resolution 1738 directly denounces intentional attacks against journalists in armed conflict, as well as any attacks against associated persons with those journalists. It was created to further provide protection of civilians in armed conflict and condemns intentional attacks against journalists and associated personnel in armed conflict situations. Freelance journalists, however, are not entitled to POW status as civilians, but per Articles 42 and 78 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, they cannot be detained except on necessary reasons of security. In comparison, despite being civilians, war correspondents accompanying the armed forces are entitled to POW status by Article 4A4 of Geneva Conventions 3. Similarly, individuals in the military press are members of the armed forces, so they can be POWs. So that brings us to a really quick intermission where we'll now move on to the women of World War II. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask now? You're free to unmute if you'd like. What is a POW status? So POW stands for prisoner of war. So in the event that someone is captured on the field, so during armed conflict, they are able to be detained as prisoners of war. Prisoners of war have certain rights and they're entitled to just and humane treatment as per the Geneva Conventions. So POW status is just, are you able to first detain this person. So you're able to detain a person if they are of like a member of the armed forces. So civilians are not entitled to POW status because they are not combatants. POW status is reserved especially just for combatants. Um, I hope that makes a little more sense. So if you're a combatant and you're captured during an armed conflict situation, you're entitled to POW status, but civilians are not allowed to be captured because they have no part in the hostilities themselves. That was a really good question. Does anyone have any more? Yeah, of course. Okay, doesn't look like there are any more rolling in, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next section.
Now let's get into the lives of the female war correspondents, how they fought against gender discrimination and barriers in the workplace to be able to join the journalistic effort of World War II alongside and oftentimes in spite of their male colleagues. The first main challenge we'll be discussing is the obstruction of women from the battlefield as a result of restrictive regulations. Women often experienced greater barriers in the accreditation process required for war zone access. This heavily limited their scope of report, forcing them to cover what was seen as the women's angle, which included stories centered on hospital scenes, nurses, and the home front in total, rather than any direct combat. Because the U.S. War Department's regulations specifically prohibited women from entering combat zones, women journalists were driven to enter war zones on their own. The second challenge many women faced was the ideology against their credibility. Due to blatant sexism, women are often accused of manipulating their male colleagues, being controlled by their emotions, or of being incompetent in their roles despite high-quality reports and publications. Because the bureaucratic restraints on women on entering the battle because of these bureaucratic restraints on entering the battlefield, the women's angle contributed to the perception of women being unfit for both combat and the reporting of combat. This overall intensely affected the view of women journalists' legitimacy as war correspondents. And of the women who were able to go out on the field and produce their own content, their work was often heavily scrutinized and altered in ways that undermined their original intent, further contributing to the silencing of female voices. The last main challenge we'll be discussing today is the sheer lack of institutional support. Military uniforms, equipment, and safety gear were all designed for men. And despite the struggles of hindered mobility in reporting conditions, women adapted to the attire, doing what they could to continue their reports as effectively as possible. Uniforms aside, women's requests for travel clearance were often denied in favor of male war correspondents' requests. This prevented them from completing their work, circling back to the problems mentioned just now. But all that aside, let's talk about three women who overcame these obstacles. We've selected three journalists who began and were best known for their contributions during World War II. These women had a direct effect on the freedoms of women in journalism today. Our first female war correspondent is Dickie Chappelle. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1919 under the name Georgette Louise Meyer, Chappelle had an interest in aviation that remained even throughout her adult years. As a teenager, she studied aeronautics, worked in local airfields, and wrote press releases for aviation shows, an activity which later led to her employment at the Transcontinental and Western Air Publicity Bureau. It was at the bureau where she met her husband and married into the name Chappelle, changing her first name to Dickie after their divorce 15 years later. She began her career in war correspondence, working with the National Geographic for the coverage of World War II. During this time, she traveled with the Marines and covered the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, using her interest in aviation as a source of inspiration for her war articles. Outside of World War II, she was an active journalist during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and unfortunately died during her later coverage of Vietnam. She was the first female war correspondent to be killed in Vietnam, in addition to being the first American female reporter to be killed in action. Chappelle had a reputation for being adamant in the face of authority. She quickly gained the respect of the Marines she traveled with and was given full Marine honors after her death. Her tombstone reads, "She was one of us, and we will miss her." Now let's talk about our next correspondent, Elizabeth Lee Miller. Born in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1907, Miller was interested in a variety of artistic mediums. As a child and teenager, she engaged in photography, costume and design, theater, drawing, and painting. And after a series of events through which she met Condé Nast, who was the Vogue magazine's publisher, came into a very short but successful modeling career where she worked with a variety of influential fashion photographers. In 1929, Miller left America to pursue her interest in photography, traveling to Paris and becoming a model for a surrealist artist known as Man Ray. Together, they rediscovered a photographic technique known as solarization, where light in a darkroom is turned on while the photograph is mid-development. Miller continued to make connections in Paris, becoming friends with the fashion editor of the French Vogue magazine, Pablo Picasso, and several other surrealist artists. She was held in high esteem among them and worked alongside Ray for the duration of her visit in Paris. Eventually, in 1932, she left Paris and returned to New York to establish her own photography studio, earning a place in several galleries and museums around New York. Only 2 years later, though, she left her studio to marry an Egyptian businessman and move to Cairo, remaining there until 1937 before moving back to Paris and meeting her second husband, a curator. Miller was living in London when the German Blitz began. As a result, her interest in photography led her to become a war photographer for Vogue magazine. And although she was a resident of England, she was not allowed to travel with the British Army, so she decided to go with the US Army instead. Once there, Miller began her career as a war correspondent by photographing nurses and prisoners of war, but she was later assigned to report on the Battle of St. Malo, where, despite not being allowed to enter the combat zone, she stayed on the front lines and photographed the first recorded use of napalm. After this, she was placed on temporary house arrest, but went on to report on the liberation of Paris, the Battle of Alsace, and the liberations of the Nazi concentration camps Buchenwald and Dachau, as well as several post-World War II scenes around Europe. Her most famous photograph pictures her sitting in Hitler's bathtub, with her dirty boots staining the floor with mud from the Dachau concentration camp. You can see this in the photo at the top left. After the war, Miller returned to England with her husband and bought a farmhouse in Chiddingly, East Sussex, remaining there with her family until her death in 1977. Even after her death, Miller remains a figurehead for women in photojournalism. She was once described as having a photography style that shocked people out of their comfort zone, a statement made in reference to her intent in accurately depicting the events of war. Now let's move on to our last war correspondent of the evening, Margaret Higgins. Born in British Hong Kong in 1920, Higgins became active in journalism about 3 years after her college enrollment in 1937, where she wrote for the Daily Californian. After graduation, she traveled to New York in search of work in the newspaper industry. During this time, she'd also applied to a master's program in the Columbia University School of Journalism, fighting for not only one of the few women allocated spots in the college, but also for the position of campus correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune. She was successful in both of these endeavors and eventually became a full-time reporter. Higgins was stationed in London and Paris towards the end of World War II, eventually traveling to Germany and reporting on the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, the Nuremberg trials, and the Soviet blockade of Berlin. Not long after, she took up the chief of the bureau position at the Tribune Bureau in Berlin, and later did the same in the one for Tokyo. During her stay in Tokyo, Higgins faced a notable amount of hostility and suspicion, as one of her previous Berlin colleagues had written about her in his book as an unprofessional and manipulative female reporter. This hostility continued until her departure for Korea during the Korean War. Even in Korea, Higgins faced gender discrimination. Soon after arriving and witnessing a bombing, she was ordered to leave the country on account of General Walton Walker, who argued that women had no place on the front lines. Higgins contested his order with Walker's superior officer, General Douglas MacArthur, who then lifted the ban on women correspondents in Korea, making headlines back home in America. As a female war correspondent, Higgins advocated for female involvement in journalism, both within and outside of warfare, remaining in international reporting for the rest of her life. She was a strong proponent of equal access for women, and despite her exceptional competitiveness and ambitious spirit being the prime target of criticism from male colleagues, she remained steadfast in her work as a reporter. Now that we've gotten through the histories of all three of the war correspondents we've selected for today, we just wanted to ask whom out of the three was most interesting to you? You can put your answer in the chat poll. Okay, I see a lot of people picking Elizabeth Miller. She was a very interesting one. She had a lot of careers over a very short period of time.
We'll leave the poll for about 30 more seconds, so just to give everyone else a chance to finish answering. Yeah, we just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone who's joined us today. We hope that you were able to take something away from our presentation. We appreciate all of your questions and participation in our activities. We're so happy to see you all here today, and we hope that we can see you again at our future events. You can continue to interact with our work at our Instagram account at Capital Area Correspondents and our LinkedIn, which is IHL Youth Action Campaign at Capital Area Chapter. Feel free to connect with our personal LinkedIn accounts as well. And we would love to support your own youth action campaigns or youth groups if you are a part of one. So please send us a follow request or put your account in the chat for everyone else to connect as well. And finally, we'd love your feedback about how we did at our event today. We have a few more events planned, and we're always looking to improve ourselves. So if you have anything you think we could improve on or things we're doing right, please let us know. Our survey only has one question for any comments you may have, and it's completely anonymous, and we really appreciate you taking the time to fill it out. We're putting the link in the chat right now, and it will also be linked in our post-event email. To our Red Crossers in the audience, please make sure to log this event for hours. Once again, NCFL Red Crossers do not need to do anything additionally. They will automatically receive hours for this event by completing the attendance form. For those of you not within our region, you will need to manually log your hours for this event. We'll also be sharing the recording of our event from today in our follow-up email as well. Does anyone have any last questions that they would like to ask about any part of our presentation? Thank you so much, Ms. Linda. We appreciate you. So I manually added everyone to the Florida calendar on our event. So if you are from North or Central Florida, so that includes up until about Tampa and the U.S. Virgin Islands, you will automatically get your hours into your volunteer connection account. If you're outside, so South Florida and everyone else in the United States plus our overseas friends, you do have to log your hours in manually. Thank you all for coming. Were there any actual laws limiting women in war? That's a really good question. As far as we can tell, there weren't any like specific laws. They were mostly internal messaging that did not allow women to join those forces. But after kind of needling people and asking and camping outside military bases, they were allowed through persistence. Thanks for that question. Thank you all for coming. Have a good night. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Was it more a misinterpretation of the obligation to protect women as vulnerable? Um, it was often due to gender prejudices that um, these bans from women on the war reporting field were put in place. If that answers your question, it was more of just like internal prejudices and things like that, rather than any kind of legal obligation. Again, during World War II, we had a lot of women on the field, or not on the field necessarily, but back at home with weapons manufacturing and things like that, that were sent and shipped out. So women were still contributing to the war effort. At home, it was just having these women on the field, like the battlefield for military reporting, was um, a concern based off of those preconceived notions. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. We will be closing the meeting soon. Linda says she works with a nurse who is one of the rare female nurses who is allowed on the front line, and only because she assisted a surgeon and he could not go without her. Yeah, I agree. There was a bias there. Not exactly a legal, like put in writing or anything, but a lot of people in positions of command just did not let women go anywhere by themselves or have any sort of power on the in warfare or on the battlefield.
Yeah, the ladies that we've selected today were more exceptions to the rule rather than the norm. Thank you for that input, Miss Linda. I completely agree with your comment. Remarkable people can find a way.
Does anyone else have any more questions or comments before we end Zoom? Thank you all for coming again.